It all started at a company work party, one of those fancy gatherings where everyone puts on their best faces while secretly vying for attention or recognition. I wasn't particularly excited about going, but my wife, Amelia, insisted. She loved these events, dressing up, mingling with my colleagues, and charming the room. It had become our routine, but something about this party felt off. As soon as we arrived, Amelia slipped away, her hand brushing mine as she excused herself to grab a drink. I watched her glide through the crowd, her laughter echoing as she joined a group near the bar. She looked radiant, but for some reason, I felt a knot tightening in my stomach. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself I was just tired. Later that evening, a heated argument erupted between my boss, Mr. Carter, and a co-worker, Jason. It was about a project deadline that Jason had botched, and the tension was palpable. Everyone else stayed quiet, but Amelia, to my surprise, stepped into the conversation. "Honestly, Mr. Carter's right," she said, her voice confident. "If Jason had communicated better, the deadline wouldn't have been an issue." Heads turned, and a ripple of awkwardness swept through the room. Jason flushed with embarrassment, while Mr. Carter nodded in approval. I stood frozen, unsure why Amelia felt the need to get involved. She wasn't just defending my boss, she was doing so with a level of passion that felt personal. Afterward, I approached her, forcing a smile. "That was bold of you." She shrugged, sipping her wine.
Someone needed to say it.
"Besides, Mr. Carter appreciates honesty." Her casual tone didn't sit right with me. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the way she spoke, confident, almost intimate, stirred unease in me. I decided to brush it off, but the nagging feeling lingered. The twist came when I went to the restroom and overheard a conversation in the hallway. Jason, still visibly upset, was venting to another coworker. "Amelia always sides with Carter," he grumbled. "You'd think she was on his payroll, or something more." The insinuation hit me like a brick. My heart raced as I stepped back into the party, scanning the room for Amelia. I found her near the bar, laughing at something Mr. Carter had said. They were standing too close, their body language too familiar. The knot in my stomach twisted tighter. Something wasn't right, and I wasn't leaving this party without answers. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of forced smiles and shallow conversations. I couldn't shake the image of Amelia and Mr. Carter standing so close, their laughter like a private joke in a crowded room. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid, but that little voice in my head wouldn't let go. As we drove home, Amelia was unusually quiet. Normally, she'd chatter about the night, commenting on who wore what or who made a fool of themselves. Tonight, she stared out the window, her face unreadable. "Quiet night for you," I said, trying to sound casual. "Just tired," she replied, her tone clipped. "Work's been exhausting lately." Her response didn't satisfy me, but I let it drop. The unease was growing, and I needed more than vague suspicions to confront her. The next morning, I decided to test the waters. "Carter seemed to like your input last night," I said over breakfast, watching her closely. She didn't look up from her coffee. "He appreciates people who are direct." "It's nothing new." "Nothing new." The words echoed in my head, and a small part of me wondered just how familiar they were with each other. But instead of pressing further, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I checked her phone while she was in the shower. I felt like a villain sneaking through her messages, my hands trembling as I opened her text app. At first, there was nothing unusual. Conversations with friends, work chats, but then I noticed a thread that was archived. It was labeled with just a single emoji, black heart. My heart pounded as I clicked on it. The messages were brief but suggestive, filled with inside jokes and compliments. The most recent one read, "Last night was fun. Can't wait for our next meeting." My breath caught in my throat. The sender's number wasn't saved, but the tone was unmistakable. I quickly took screenshots and sent them to my email, closing the app just as I heard the water turn off. When Amelia came out, wrapped in a towel and humming to herself, I forced a smile, pretending nothing had happened. Inside, though, I was unraveling. Who was this person? Was it Mr. Carter? Or was there someone else? I knew I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I needed more proof, something undeniable. Whatever was happening, I was going to find out. You said. Over the next few days, I couldn't focus on anything. At work, every glance in Mr. Carter's direction felt like a punch to the gut. Was it him? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? Amelia carried on as if everything was normal. Kisses on the cheek before she left for work, casual conversations over dinner. But every moment felt like a charade. I decided to dig deeper. That evening, I told Amelia I'd be working late, but instead of heading to the office, I parked a few blocks away from her workplace. I felt ridiculous, like a character in some cheap drama, but I had to know. Around 6 p.m., the office lights dimmed as people began to leave. I watched as employees filtered out one by one. Just as I was about to give up, I spotted Amelia stepping outside. She wasn't alone. Mr. Carter walked beside her, their conversation animated. They stood by his car for a moment, laughing. Then, to my horror, he placed a hand on her lower back, guiding her toward the passenger seat. She didn't flinch, didn't move away. Instead, she climbed into his car with ease, as if this was something they'd done before. I followed them, careful to keep my distance. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear the sound of my own thoughts. They drove across town to a dimly lit restaurant, the kind of place where no one would recognize them. I parked nearby, watching as they entered. Through the window, I saw them seated at a corner table, leaning in close, their faces glowing in the soft light. It wasn't a business meeting. The way they looked at each other, the way she laughed at his jokes, it was intimate, personal. My chest tightened as I pulled out my phone. Snapping a few photos from the car felt like a betrayal of my own dignity, but I needed proof. This wasn't just my imagination anymore. I waited until they finished their dinner and left the restaurant. Instead of going home, I followed them to a nearby hotel. My hands were shaking as I parked and watched them walk inside, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. This was it, the proof I needed. But instead of feeling relief, all I felt was a crushing sense of loss. The woman I thought I knew, the life we had built together, it was all unraveling before my eyes. As I sat there in the darkness, I realized I had a choice to make. Confront her now, or wait until I had even more evidence. The thought of playing this charade any longer made my stomach turn, but I wasn't ready to face her. Not yet. I drove home, my mind racing. I needed a plan. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than just me. And I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The next morning, Amelia acted as though nothing had happened. She greeted me with her usual smile, kissed me on the cheek, and asked, "Coffee or tea today?" Her casual tone made my blood boil, but I kept my composure. I wasn't ready to tip my hand, not yet. As soon as she left for work, I began putting my plan into action. First, I gathered all the evidence I had, screenshots of her texts, photos from the restaurant, and even the time-stamped picture of her walking into the hotel with Mr. Carter. It was undeniable, a web of lies she couldn't escape. But confrontation wasn't enough. I needed her to feel the weight of her actions, to see the world she had so carefully built come crashing down. That evening, I told her I had a last-minute dinner meeting with a client and wouldn't be home until late. Amelia barely reacted, just gave a quick, "Okay, don't wait up for me either. I have a lot of work to catch up on." The lie slipped out so effortlessly that it almost impressed me. Instead of going to dinner, I followed her again. This time I was prepared with more than just my phone. She drove straight to the hotel. My stomach churned as I watched her park and step out, her phone in hand, glancing around before walking inside. My heart sank further when Mr. Carter arrived minutes later, his car sliding into the spot next to hers like it belonged there. I wasn't going to wait in the shadows this time. I walked into the lobby, head held high, and approached the front desk. "I'm looking for my wife," I said, keeping my voice calm. "She just checked in. Could you let her know I'm here?" The clerk hesitated, glancing nervously between me and the screen. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't share guest information." I leaned in, lowering my voice. "I'm not asking for details. Just send her a message. Room 204, right?" It was a calculated guess based on what I'd seen last night, and when the clerk's eyes widened slightly, I knew I'd hit the mark. Moments later, a staff member escorted me to the room. My heart was pounding, a mixture of anger and heartbreak fueling my every step. When the door opened, Amelia's shocked face greeted me, her expression quickly shifting from surprise to dread. "Michael," she stammered, her voice shaky. "What are you doing here?" Behind her, Mr. Carter stood frozen, his face pale. His usually confident demeanor was nowhere to be seen. I stepped inside, pulling out my phone. "I could ask you the same thing," I said, my voice cold. I held up the photos, the texts, the evidence of her betrayal. "Explain this?" Amelia's face crumpled as she struggled to find the words. "It's not what it looks like," she whispered. I laughed bitterly. "Not what it looks like. You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around, and now this? Tell me, Amelia, what does it look like?" She looked at Mr. Carter, then back at me, her eyes filled with guilt. But I didn't wait for an answer. I turned on my heel and walked out, leaving the door wide open behind me. As I stepped into the elevator, I could hear Amelia calling after me, her voice frantic. But I didn't stop. The truth was out, and now it was time for me to decide what came next. I drove home that night in silence, the weight of everything crashing down on me. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my thoughts a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. The evidence was clear, the confrontation was done, but the hollow ache in my chest refused to subside. When I reached home, I sat in the driveway for a long time, staring at the house that once symbolized love and stability. It felt foreign now, tainted by Amelia's deceit. I knew I couldn't go inside and pretend everything was fine. There was no pretending anymore. Instead, I went to a nearby hotel, booking a room for the night. Alone in the dimly lit room, I opened my laptop and began drafting an email to a divorce lawyer. The pain of it all was suffocating, but I had to think logically now. Every piece of evidence I had collected was attached to that email, screenshots, photos, timestamps. It was thorough, undeniable, and final. Amelia called me several times that night. I didn't answer. Each voicemail she left alternated between tearful apologies and frantic explanations. "Please, Michael, just let me talk to you." "It's not what you think," she pleaded. But I'd heard enough lies to last a lifetime. The next morning, I returned to the house. Amelia was waiting for me, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She rushed toward me as soon as I walked through the door. "Michael, please, let's talk," she said, her voice trembling. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but it didn't mean anything." I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Didn't mean anything? You don't accidentally sneak around, book hotels, and betray your husband. That's not a mistake, Amelia. That's a choice." Tears streamed down her face as she tried to reach for my hand, but I pulled away. "I trusted you," I said, my voice breaking. "I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me?" Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't let them sway me. "I've already contacted a lawyer," I continued, my tone cold. "You'll be hearing from them soon. And I want you out of this house by the end of the week." Amelia looked at me with a mix of shock and desperation. "Michael, please," she begged. "We can fix this. I love you." It was a mistake, I swear. I turned away, unable to bear the sight of her anymore. "You didn't think about love when you were with him. It's too late." Without another word, I walked upstairs, leaving her standing there, broken and defeated. For the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of control. The life I thought I had with Amelia was gone, but I was determined to rebuild, stronger and wiser than before. The end was near, but the healing had just begun. The days that followed were a whirlwind of change. Amelia packed her things and moved out as I requested, though not without several attempts to plead her case. Each time she tried to explain or apologize, I stopped her. There was no room for excuses anymore. The house felt quieter, almost eerily so, but it was a silence I welcomed. I no longer had to wonder where she was, or who she was with. The weight of suspicion had lifted, replaced by a strange sense of relief. I had chosen myself over the pain of betrayal, and while it hurt, it also felt empowering. One evening, as I sat in the living room sorting through old photos, I stumbled upon a wedding picture of us. We looked so happy, so full of hope for the future. For a moment, I let myself grieve, not just for the marriage, but for the life we had built and the dreams we'd shared. I knew it was important to feel the pain fully if I was ever going to move forward. The divorce process was swift, thanks to the overwhelming evidence I had provided. Amelia didn't fight back. Perhaps she knew there was no justification for what she had done. By the time the papers were signed, I felt a strange sense of closure. This chapter of my life was officially over. In the weeks that followed, I began to rediscover myself. I joined a local hiking group, something I had always wanted to do, but never had time for. The first hike was grueling, but as I reached the top of the trail, gazing out at the expansive view of mountains and valleys, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. I also started reconnecting with friends, sharing my story with those I trusted. Their support reminded me that I wasn't alone and that life goes on, even after betrayal. Slowly but surely, I began to rebuild, focusing on my career, my health, and my happiness. One day, as I was walking through a park, I spotted a young couple laughing together. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of sadness, but it was fleeting. I realized I no longer envied what they had. Instead, I looked forward to whatever the future might hold for me. The story ends not with revenge, but with renewal. Betrayal had broken me, but it had also taught me to value myself and to never settle for anything less than honesty and love. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine to rebuild, and I was ready for whatever came next. The final message: sometimes, the hardest choices lead to the greatest strength. Healing isn't linear, but it's always worth it.